Okay. So my talk today is on perceiving affordances for passing through apertures, a discussion of factors influencing replication across XR. And this is a paper that I co-wrote with my colleagues Janine Stefanucci and Bobby Bodenheimer. So the study of affordances in extended reality has grown over recent years, and it has the potential to advance both basic and applied research goals. Affordances are action possibilities in an environment that are directly related to an observer's body or capabilities. So for example, the stepability of a gap depends not only on the size of the gap, but on the leg length of the actor. And an aperture is passable if it's wider than the widest part of the actor's body. So why are affordances of interest to extended reality researchers? We discussed two contributions of the study of affordances in the context of replication. First is the ability of affordances to serve as a measure of perceptual fidelity across different types of extended reality technologies. By perceptual fidelity, we mean the extent to which mediated spaces are perceived similarly to the real world. And second is the ability of affordances to elucidate the role of the body in perception of the world. A number of affordances have been studied in extended reality, but here in this paper, we focus on judgments of passability or passing through doorways or apertures. And this is along the continuum of XR environments, including the real world, smartphone and head-mounted augmented reality, and virtual reality. Warren and Wang first demonstrated that humans perceive the affordance of passability based on the intrinsic body dimension of shoulder width, as compared to the width of the aperture that one is considering passing through. Their findings operationalized Gibson's notion of affordances as possibilities for action that are determined only by taking into account the fit between properties of the body in the context of the dimensions of an environment. Passability tasks can be static, as in judging what's passable without passing through, or dynamic, as in an actual walking task. In two experiments, Warren and Wang found that men of different shoulder widths consistently turned when walking through an aperture that was less than 1.3 times their shoulder width. And they judged from a static viewpoint that the narrowest apertures that they could pass through without turning were about 1.16 times their shoulder width. So what this means is that people needed an aperture that was about 16% greater than their shoulder width in order to judge that they could pass through without turning. And a number of studies have employed these methods to study effects of feedback or on calibration of passability judgments as well. Typically, passability judgment tasks use one of two psychophysical methods. The first is the method of adjustment, where the participant adjusts an interval continuously so that it's set at the just passable width. Or second, the method of constant stimuli, where widths are presented randomly around the threshold of passability, and the crossover point where the participant switches from judging passability from yes to no is calculated. Then that crossover point is divided by the participant's actual ability, in other words, their shoulder width, to obtain the perceived critical threshold for passability for each person. It's also the case that different analysis methods can be used. The probability of yes responses can be modeled with analyses such as logistical regression and multi-level modeling, or the critical thresholds can be calculated and then the mean differences compared across conditions. Perceived affordances have been studied for decades within the ecological psychology framework, but have only been applied to the study of perception and action in XR environments more recently. Using first virtual reality, Geis et al. In 2010 established that judgments of passability through an aperture formed by two poles were similar in the real world and virtual reality, finding no difference in matched real and virtual laboratory spaces, as you can see here. More recently, Bhargava et al. Assessed passability judgments through a virtual replica of a sliding doorway as compared to a visually matched real doorway. Here you can see virtual and real again, and in this case, with and without a full body avatar in VR. Participants in this task were allowed to walk towards the doorway, but not through it if they were uncertain about their judgment. And they found no difference between the VR conditions, but VR judgments were significantly wider than those in the real world. Similar approaches have been taken more recently with augmented reality. So for example, Pointed et al. Replicated the Geis et al. Study, but using AR with the HoloLens. And they also found no difference between AR and the real world for passability judgments. Then Gagnon et al.'s AR study used a more realistic sliding wall similar to Bhargava's VR studies. And in addition, they used a block design to test the role of feedback about the outcome of passing through on passability judgments. And then most recently, using mobile AR and novel visual cues for feedback, Zhao et al. Evaluated passability judgments towards apertures, again using AR polls, presented through smartphones in a study run remotely in the wild. They found that average passability ratios, about 1.1 times shoulder width in the initial pretest, resembled those found in the real world in VR and head-mounted AR, suggesting that mobile AR is a viable platform for assessing affordances. So generally, estimates across VR, AR, and the real world do not differ statistically, although there are a few exceptions. And this is generally good news for perceptual fidelity, where we care about the similarity in perception and action across different extended realities. But in reviewing this work, we found some differences in the critical thresholds that are reported from the studies. So this is the ratio of the estimate of what is just passable to actual shoulder width. And we found a range from about 0.96, so this is some underestimation of the width needed, to 1.18, which is overestimation of the width needed, which is more similar to the established studies in the real world. So we can ask, why might these differences occur? And although generally similar methodologies are used, there are a number of differences that should be explored that might explain a lack of replicability. As you saw in some of the examples that I presented, the style of the aperture varies from poles to walls to doorways. And some procedures include movement towards the aperture, even when people don't actually pass through. Some have avatars, seen in mirrors often, which provides more body-based information and feedback. And finally, if we're scaling a ratio to the actual shoulder width, the way that body width is measured is likely critical. This became especially apparent in our own mobile AR study done in the wild, where users had to measure their own shoulder width. Moving on to our second question, the role of the body in perception of the world has also been examined in extended reality. Passability tasks in the real world inherently include vision of the body and changes to the body, such as extending arm length with a tool or holding wide objects or sitting in a wheelchair, have been shown to influence judgments of size, distance, and affordances. Extended reality provides a method to easily manipulate and control the presence of body-based cues in ways that are difficult to do in the real world. Bhargava and colleagues examined the influence of both avatar bodies and extensions of the body, for example, holding an object on passability judgments. So in a study that involved avatars and virtual handheld objects that were smaller or larger than body width, avatars influenced both the accuracy of affordance judgments and how well the object was incorporated into those judgments after feedback. Other studies, such as Zhao et al. In their smartphone study, found that a visual cue representing shoulder width, so you maybe can see here, influenced later judgments even without the cue present by moving estimates closer to actual shoulder width. And finally, Buck et al. Examined passability of dyads through an aperture, finding gender differences in the real world and avatar-based differences in VR that were consistent with the single user findings of Bhargava and colleagues. Although there are similarities in the methodologies used, there are a number of differences that could influence conclusions about perceptual fidelity and the role of body-based feedback. Differences in the effects of the style of the aperture, such as a wall versus poles, have not been systematically studied, and these effects could interact with the type of technology used. We think that a larger question is how different types of feedback might influence judgments of passability. Avatars, for example, provide one form of visual motor feedback. Walking up to or through the aperture provides another. And further testing of the role of different types of feedback will help us really to better understand and interpret possible differences across studies. And finally, it's notable that there is variation in the critical thresholds of passability. Both methodological procedures and analysis methods are important to consider as explanations for differences in the conclusions that are made about critical threshold ratios. So I'd like to end here and specifically acknowledge the graduate students who led many of our own passability studies at Utah and Vanderbilt, Grant Poynton, Brooke Zhao, and Holly Gagnon, as well as acknowledge our support from the Office of Naval Research and the National Science Foundation for this work. I'm happy to discuss or answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, are there any questions from the audience? Doesn't seem to be the case in Zoom also. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much.
So
then I guess we just continue with
can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Ed has a question.
Okay.
I was just wondering where the sound is coming from.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So Sarah, what is the overall finding about this task and perceptual fidelity? You know, kind of the
kind of take home message.
Yeah, the larger message of that.
Well, I think that generally from our work, we've found kind of closer perceptual fidelity and affordances than we have with distance perception measures. So, you know, I think there could be different reasons for that. One could be there are different types of judgments. So we're, you know, making judgments about a potential action, often making judgments about kind of different intervals, such as like walking through an aperture or stepping over a gap, may be different than judging distances that are further away, or judging distances in different ways. So I would say, like, generally, I think that that they are a good measure of perceptual fidelity in the sense that we can see this pushed around a bit, but we also see, like, you know, relatively accurate performance in what people say they can do in extended reality compared to the real world. I do think there's, as I was saying, there's, you know, quite a bit of variation in what we see across studies, across labs, across different types of environments. And that's something that I think needs to be teased apart more to see, is it, you know, the methodologies, is it the way that the data is analyzed? Is it some combination of the way that the body is measured and the way that the tasks are being done?
I guess it's still not replicated to the degree of, you know, perceived distance. So.
You mean there haven't been as many studies done?
Right, yeah.
Yes, I think that's true. And it's only been, you know, a few affordances compared to the number of affordances maybe that have been studied in the real world. I think what we've seen in the VR literature, first of all, there's really not very much done with AR, but in VR, we've seen mostly reachability studies, whether you can reach to something, and passability, I think, have been the two main types of affordances.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, then let's continue with the presentation from Corey Shaman. He's also from University of Utah. He's a PhD student there.
Yes, I have the very hard task of following my mentor. So my name is Corey Shaman, and I am an MD PhD student at the University of Utah, working with Sarah Creamer-Gear and Janine Stefanucci in the VAST lab. And we study how we combine our senses. And so I'm particularly interested in this from a physician scientist standpoint, because many of my patients have sensory impairments, and I'm trying to get a better sense of how we use all of this information, whether individuals with sensory loss, or if we think about aging as a potential patient population, how these individuals actually combine their senses. And I've put about 14 months now of blood, sweat, and tears into a replication study. So I can confirm, Ed, that it is often just as difficult to replicate a study as it is to start a new study. And I'll tell you a little bit about the study that we're replicating. And so we often think of navigation, which is the particular task that I'm interested in. Navigation is a combination of using our vision and our self-motion cues, our vestibular sense and our proprioceptive sense. And so we took this study from 2014 by Sarah Bates and Thomas Wolbers, which looks at how the aging process affects how we use our senses to navigate. And we're interested in aging, particularly because we don't quite understand why individuals have poorer navigation ability as they age, but we're interested in looking at sensory integration as a potential pathology. And so what this study did in the real world is they used a homing paradigm where participants navigated via multiple waypoints. So they started at some start point, they walked to target 1, they walked to target 2, and they walked to target 3. And then at this point, there was about a 10-second interlude in which we altered which sensory information participants had access to. And so what they did, as what we did, is they spun participants in a chair in some instances to remove self-motion information to give people access to only their vision, or they turned off these 3 distinct landmarks so that people didn't have any visual information, or individuals had access to both, or as I'll point out in one of our use cases of virtual reality, they did the very difficult task of shifting people's vision by having a second set of covert landmarks. And they did all of this in the dark. So in the real world, this requires extra precautions, such as navigating in a dark space, to really carefully control what visual information people have access to. So we tried to do a direct replication of this study, looking at how individuals combine their senses. And so this is our real world task, which looks very similar to what you saw before. And then we went on to extend this into virtual reality, which was great for us because you can do things like covertly shift where landmarks are in space without participants noticing and without having to navigate in a dark environment. And so to get back to this paper, we learned some lessons in these 14 months of doing this study. And so in the process of trying to replicate something directly, we had to very carefully comb through the methods, and some things were actually really well described. So we, learned a lot from Bates and Wolbers, but we didn't quite understand a few things, such as how the trials were blocked or how dark the environment was. In sensory cue combination studies such as these, it's really important to understand how much light people have access to. And in doing a direct replication, we ran into some of these more methods questions of just not quite understanding how in our dark basement room, which is ideal conditions, we still struggled to block out some of the exit sign lighting. And we wondered how Bates and Wolbers might have done this. We also had questions in terms of how participants were characterized. They reported that they had everyone wear sunglasses to block out extra light so that the experimenters could see in the room while the participants doing this task could not. But we had no indication of how much light was actually attenuated. The other thing, in looking at these like 1 to 2 hour long studies with older adults, you start to get into how fit are these participants. We figured out that we had to recruit sort of extremely healthy older adults. And so we looked to recruit from populations that did a lot of hiking or skiing. But from recruiting from the more general population, we saw a little bit higher attrition. And so that wasn't well characterized for us to directly replicate. And then there were questions of how the analysis was done. So how were the coordinate data coded and processed, and how were outliers handled? All of these things sort of seem arbitrary when you're reading through a paper, but become explicitly important when you're doing a direct replication. And so then after we did the direct replication, we decided to extend this into virtual reality as a second part of our experimental paradigm. And so we used the Vario VR3, which is an interesting new head-mounted display that has near human resolution. And so while we do have some concerns about resolution, that would apply more in other head-mounted displays. And then the other things that are slightly different about virtual reality are that without an avatar, it's sort of hard to figure out where the rest of your body is in space. And so we're navigating in the real world. You might have a visual reference for your foot hitting the ground. You no longer have that in VR. And then, you're wearing a screen essentially on your head. And so there's this potential bias if we're trying to figure out how much are you using your vision to navigate versus how much are you using your other cues. It's interesting now that people might have a bias because they might trust that the only thing they really can count on is what's on their head or that visual display. And then there's a potential lag of vision in the display relative to other information like vestibular senses. So why use VR in the first place? VR actually makes it really easy to decouple or alter the sensory information that we provide. And so as we start to look at patient populations, we can actually very easily blur fields to simulate low vision, or we can change some of the characteristics of the display, such as the optic flow, or just use VR as a way to really hide the fact that we're shifting landmarks in some of the conditions. And so I'm just going to tease our data. I'm not going to jump too much into it. So we found that in the real world, so you're looking now at the x-axis is real world and VR across a couple of different conditions. And overall, we're looking at the variability of this homing task in terms of standard deviation. And so participants performed in our 2 studies very similarly, with the exception that the self-motion condition had higher variability in VR, which was interesting because now participants are performing in the daylight in VR versus in the completely dark environment. And so what did we learn? We learned that we have to be really careful that even when we transition into VR, we could be providing new sensory cues. We learned that the corded device, the Vario, actually, if we weren't really careful, could provide a tactile cue from the corded tether. And that information such as how we texture our ground can repeat in ways that can create what participants perceive as a gridded texture, or be able to sort of use some extra cues from the ground that we might not have intended. And so a lot of these considerations that we have or recommendations are really similar to what Ed mentioned earlier. We found that a detailed methods section is crucial, with perhaps even more detail than you might think is necessary. Using analytical techniques that are made public via open science framework, especially considering those design choices when extending studies into virtual reality. Things like lighting, shadows, how you handle the horizon become really important design characterizations. And then, you know, doing the hard work of carefully piloting to understand, you know, perhaps run some things in the real world and then run them in VR and look to see how things might be different. And so with that, I'd like to thank my lab, my mentors, Sarah Creamer-Gear and Janine Stefanucci. And then my funding sources are currently the American Otological Society and the University of Utah Center on Aging. And so with that, I will take any questions or discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any questions? No. Ed? Yeah.
So suppose this paper you replicated had uploaded their data set to the open science. I mean, would that have helped answer some or all of these or many of them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I think about it, the thing that would help me the most in this 14-month-long replication study is having started with a spreadsheet that was like, here is the outcome variable that we measured, and here is exactly how we transformed it, which data points were excluded, how we coded everything. That would be immensely helpful. And I highly encourage everyone to publish that sort of supplementary data along with their manuscript when they publish on this content.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hey, this is Arifin. I'm a PhD student from Dr. Edson's lab. I recently graduated, recently defended my dissertation. So I have a question regarding the direct replication of VR. So in the recommendation, you was just talked about that direct replication as a recommendations you mentioned. My question is like in general, not like for specific this work. Is it actually possible to do the direct replication in VR? That considering the environment, for example, if we have a research method and in real world condition, and when we do the things, it becomes a partial, there's some conceptual replication, but the direct replication to me is more powerful, like using the same thing. But is it actually possible in VR doing the direct replication? And is actually like there's a lot of discussion about different headset, different resolution. Do you think like these changes of the display, these changes of the resolution will put impact on the results or something like that?
Yeah, congratulations on your PhD defense.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think that it's possible to call it a direct replication study if you are extending something that was originally done in the real world to VR. I think there's inherent differences in what factors you have to think about and what sensory information people have access to generally. And that's why we did the hard task of actually redoing this study in the real world first. And so we tried to do as direct of a replication as we could in the real world. And then we had our own real world data set to compare to the original real world data set. And then we ported everything over into VR. We tried to run it as similarly as possible. And now I consider that more of a conceptual replication at that point. But now we have these sort of two paradigms, right? We have the comparison against the original study and our own internal comparison, real world to VR. And so I think that makes it slightly more powerful. But I definitely think as soon as you move to a different modality, such as VR or augmented reality, that now you're in the conceptual territory. And I think that both have something important to offer us.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yes.
So,
yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Are there any more questions? No. Okay, good. Then we will come to our next speaker, Florian Echtler, which is also one of the organizers of this workshop. He's from Aalborg University, and he will tell you something about replication in HCI and bioinformatics.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope this works. Sound seems good. Yeah, so good morning because it's morning for me. So good afternoon. Let's see if this works here. Share screen. Yes. All right. I think that works. So, all right. What I want to talk about is based on a paper we published at CHI 2020. So this is coming from a slightly different community, more on the HCI side. And my co-authors here were Chad from University of Zurich, I think by now Swansea University, Lucas, Steve from Paris, and myself. So yeah, again, slightly different context. So the big question up front, of course, was for us, why do we actually do this research in the HCI community? What's the goal in the end? And there's a paper by Antti Olasrytter and Kasper Hornbeck about HCI research as problem solving, which basically just asks the question, how can we improve the human use of computing? And that is an iterative process where we, oh, thank you, where we have, hello, good morning, where we have a research problem of different types, then we have a potential solution, and that improves our use of computing and may lead to the next question. So of course, for this cycle to work, we need, first of all, we need evaluations and we need data. I think that I'm preaching to the choir here. You're all already familiar that there's a gap here. Google Scholar has this nice slogan about standing on the shoulders of giants, which you've probably also all heard of. And of course, that means that if we want to actually see farther than those before us, then we need something to build on, and that's where the gap is, of course. Even in recent years, it's been quite obvious that this has helped a lot. So if we had the old traditional approach where basically everybody keeps sitting on their data for as long as possible, then we probably wouldn't have gotten to a point where we have a COVID vaccine as quickly. So there's also some very real world implications of having open data, especially in such a kind of dynamic and threatening situation as we've had over the last couple of years. But let's briefly talk a bit about the bigger context. As I said, I'm kind of from the HCI community, and HCI is a very, very diverse area. So there's, of course, a big chunk of computer science in there and engineering, but there's also design, psychology, cognitive science, psychology over here, social psychology over there, infosec, so many different aspects that play into this very diverse field or discipline. If we compare it to ISMAR, which I've also published at a couple of times, then ISMAR is maybe more located in this upper right corner between computer science, human factors, engineering, and so on. But there are, so it could, in a sense, also be considered part of this larger area of HCI, of course, with a different focus, more to the upper right in this diagram, but still part of the same bigger context. And therefore, I think the findings we had from the larger HCI community will also at least up to a certain degree, apply to ISMAR and its research fields. So, but first of all, how this all started out was that I was discussing this with a longtime friend and colleague of mine, Max Häusler, who is a bioinformatics researcher and working on the UCSC genome browser, if that's familiar to anyone. And so what we did in 2018 was to have a look at papers from the CHI conference and papers from a important bioinformatics conference, and just compare basically their use of open source. So this was kind of a pre-study focused on specifically open source, not open data in the wider sense, but open source software. And especially on the question how many of these papers would actually hand out some kind of source code from their research. So we analyzed both extended abstracts and full papers from these conferences for 2016 and 2017. We looked at how many actually talk about open source, how many have at least supplemental material, and how many could we verify that they would actually release any source code from their research. And we ended up with percentages around 2.0 and 2.6% in total. And if we compare this to the ISMB International Symposium on Molecular Biology, I think then we have a much bigger percentage, even in 2016 and even more in 2017. So there are fields where this is obviously much more common to hand out your data, and that kind of relates back to what I mentioned earlier about COVID-19. Of course, if biology and genome research and so on are more open with that, that helped, of course, in this context as well. But in the HCI area, there's definitely a bit of room for improvement if you look at these numbers. And keep in mind, this is only looking at source code. So this is a very narrow view, but still there's definitely a gap here. Sorry. All right, so if you look at any research project in this area, HCI, virtual reality, extended reality, you name it, I think this is generic enough to apply to any of them. And what could it actually generate? So we have some kind of study materials. That can be a questionnaire, that can be a virtual environment like the ones we saw in the talks before. These doorways, for example, whatever stimuli you present to your participants, this can be considered study materials. Then you have data that's generated. Of course, you have the absolute raw log files, measurement data. It can be questionnaire responses, but it can also be timing data, for example, from your virtual environment. So that's basically something in a CSV file or in a spreadsheet. Then, of course, you need some sort of processing procedure that turns this raw data into diagrams, into statistical analysis, maybe also into categories. So if you have qualitative data from a questionnaire, then this processing procedure might actually involve a bunch of Post-its and a whiteboard, but still it's a way to come from the raw data to some sort of output, to some sort of conclusion, whether that's categories or diagrams or statistical conclusions. Still, all of this is a way to come from the data from your experiment to some kind of output. And last but not least, of course, we have the prototypes themselves. That can be hardware. That could be a new HMD, for example. It could be the software that you wrote for specifically for your study. But in almost all cases, you have some sort of prototype that was involved in your study. In some cases, this might not actually apply if you just have a virtual environment that's running on some stock Oculus Quest hardware or whatever. Then you might not actually have a prototype, but in most cases you do. So this is everything that could conceivably be the outcome of a research project in our wider community. And what a lot of people now tend to say is, well, yes, of course, it's important to share data, but I don't want to make it that public. So if somebody wants my data or my code, then they can just ask me and I will hand it out, of course. Might or might not be true. Let's look at that in a second. Another thing that you see quite often is that, well, I will share it. People don't have to ask me. I will put it on GitHub. And that's actually, I have to admit, that's my go-to approach as well, because it's so convenient and it's really quick and it's nice to work with once it's on GitHub. So that's also a common sentiment. But again, there might be some pitfalls here. Let's look at that in a second. And last but not least, what also a few people from the, especially if they are involved with health data, for example, just like we saw in the previous talk, a lot of people are actually very reluctant to put any data online that has kind of data from study participants in there in any way, even if it's not health data. So there's kind of a let's call it overabundance of privacy in some cases. And again, the question is, do we actually need it? So let's have a look at those in a bit more detail. There have actually been studies where people tried exactly that. They tried to ask researchers from other publications, could I have your data? And the outcome was kind of expected, 27% success rate. So they asked 141 authors contact authors from articles in psychology journals from just 1 year before, and just 1 year already caused like 18% of no reply at all, either undeliverable email or just nothing. Then I'm not sharing my data after all, 35%. I will share my data, but I don't actually do it, 20%, and then just 27% in total that handed out their data either right away or after poking. So that's not a very good success rate. So if people say, I'll share my data if somebody else asks, then that's a nice sentiment, but reality doesn't really support that so much. So a lot of people who are in this slice might not actually have refused outright to share their data, but they may not actually had access to it anymore. So let's say the first author was a master student or an intern that just left and took the repository with them, and nobody really considered to keep the data. So then that might not actually be malice, but just bad luck here or bad planning in a sense. The same actually happened for biology as well. So they did a longer kind of had a longer term picture and looked at articles from up to 20 years of age and tried to figure out if they can actually still access the data. So all of this is under the condition that the author actually responded to the request. And as we saw in the previous study, that's not a guarantee in the first place. So under the condition that the author is still around, the odds of still being able to access the data is going down by 17% every year, roughly. So after 20 years, the odds are somewhere here around 10%, maybe, what's this? Maybe 30, but somewhere in this area. So not so good after all. So definitely this kind of statement, if somebody else wants my code or data, just ask me. That's just that's good intentions, but nothing else basically. And reality doesn't really support that that so well. All right, so the other thing a lot of people do, and again, I'm not excluding myself here, is to just put stuff on GitHub because it's, especially for code and kind of structured data of any kind, it's very nice. So, but there's a catch again. So you can, of course, always kind of hide a repository from public view again after the fact. So you could delete it outright, make it read-only, not so bad, but you could transfer it. So it's kind of under a different URL. You could just make it private so nobody can access it anymore. That's stuff the authors themselves can do. And then, of course, there's kind of the question of GitHub is a for-profit company. So what will they do? There's been a bit of discussion recently around GitHub Copilot, which analyzes data from public GitHub repositories and puts them into this code completion assistant thing. And at some point, Microsoft might just decide to turn it all into a paid model. Unlikely, but still possible. And so GitHub isn't as convenient as it is. It's maybe not the most reliable place to put public data after all. So there's alternatives, luckily. There's Open Science Foundation, which a lot of you might already be aware of, and Zenodo. So OSF has this $250,000 preservation fund, which should be good enough for like 50 years of at least of recording the data. CERN has Zenodo, which is hosted at CERN, has a 20-year kind of horizon immediately, and very likely a much longer one than that. So there's a lot of good alternatives, which maybe not quite as accessible, but there's a really easy workaround for that, which I'll come to towards the end. So again, GitHub might be nice, a nice front end, but maybe not the best long-term solution. And sorry. And another kind of roadblock that we've seen quite a lot is that people are actually very reluctant to share data from their study participants. But that might be true, of course, if you have really, really fine-grained information. But in many cases, you don't actually need a lot of information that could identify participants. Of course, there's been studies where people try to re-identify people from very small amounts of publicly available information. And so for kind of malicious actors, that might be an option, but in a very large amount of realistic cases, that's not relevant. And even if you have that sort of information, then you could still, in many cases, anonymize it relatively easy. And if all of that doesn't work, then there's still the option to have protected repositories. So for example, Open Science Foundation actually offers that you can have password protected repositories and so on. And especially if the participants actually feel that there is a benefit from them participating in the study and maybe even sharing their data, especially in the health context, then they're more than willing often to actually do that, to support that this data, as long as it's anonymized or pseudonymized, then that this data is publicly available. And so you can easily get consent from participants if you only explain it properly upfront, of course. All right, so that was kind of a little bit of the prejudices that exist around data sharing. So now what we did in our paper was to try and actually have a look at how does that work in the field of HCI? How well does it actually kind of work, or doesn't it work? So we did a survey, online survey of authors of the 2018 and 2019 editions of the conference, and basically asked 3 questions. What type of research artifacts do they actually have in their paper? If it's shared, then how is it shared? And if it's not shared, why? In both years, we got 34% of response rate, which we consider quite high. So 460 out of a total of 1356 invitations. Again, we have about 700 Chi papers each year. Maybe it's even a bit more by now, but so this is a big conference, and we did get quite some feedback. And so the big overview here would be that we have something around 34% of study materials being shared, something around 20% of raw data, and both selective and non-selective. So meaning that there has been some pre-filtering done or no pre-filtering at all. The qualitative data processing procedure is maybe shared in a quarter of cases. The quantitative data processing maybe even a little more often, but still at most 1/3. Qualitative output data and quantitative output data is actually shared almost the most of any of these data types. There's maybe a reason for that. I'll come to that in a moment. And for software and hardware, we have something, yes, around 1/3 also of cases. Hardware is actually getting, and software getting kind of a step up in terms of the second year of the analysis got more, but of course we only have these 2 snapshots, so it's too early to say that there's actually an upward trend over the years. Quantitative output data is, of course, basically, if you have, like I mentioned before, a categorizing process, for example, then the quantitative output data is basically just the categories. And that's often something you see directly in the paper. So for that reason, a lot of people answered actually that they are sharing this. But the level of detail, I think there might be a bit of different levels of how this is perceived. So the people who write the paper might consider just putting the categories in the paper to actually be already the output data that they created. But from a replication point of view, that might not be enough. So there may be some misconceptions here at play, especially for the quantitative procedures and output data. But yes, this is the overall picture that we saw. So let's break it down a little more, looking back at the bigger questions, bigger issues we saw before. So which type of study materials are only shared on request, or which type of data from the project? So study materials, 14%. On the other hand, raw data, 64%. So that's something most people like to keep close. And we also had quantitative questions in our questionnaire to figure out why people don't do that. And a lot of people are actually afraid that if they share their raw data, then some reviewer will come along and have even more opportunities to poke holes in their research because they forgot to do something with the raw data that they should have done. There weren't any concrete examples, but just people were worried that this might give the community yet another angle from which to kind of rip their paper into shreds. That's more or less the exact wording some of the participants used. And for this reason, the the raw data is usually kind of kept closer, let's say. Also, the data processing procedure and the raw output in a sense, and the software. So for all of these, there's a pretty big chunk of people who say, well, sharing, yes, but people have to ask me first. And as we saw before, in reality, that won't really work a lot. So for GitHub, stuff that's shared only on GitHub, that's actually a big chunk. So, I mean, as I said before, at least it is shared at all. Even though GitHub might not be the best long-term option, at least there is something. And so what's not really on GitHub for some reason is the data processing procedure, the qualitative especially. And I mean, yes, you can guess at the reason, because qualitative researchers in the HCI field tend to come more from disciplines that don't focus too much on statistics and on kind of repetitive procedures, but rather on these, how do I say that, less formal procedures such as card sorting. So they don't have an R script, for example, that you can use to analyze your data, as opposed to the quantitative procedures. There you could actually put your whole statistical analysis script on GitHub quite easily, and people are also doing that, as you can see. But the qualitative procedures are less well defined, and therefore, of course, also less likely to be on GitHub, or rather completely unlikely in that case. Software and hardware, okay, that's nice. As I said, there may be room for improvement, but at least there is some sharing going on. However, of course, for a full-blown proper replication, you would need all of this to be on GitHub, not just some software snapshot. And that's also something where there's still a lot of room for improvement. Last but not least, the other kind of prejudice about not sharing participant data online. Why did people say they don't share data? So a very high number of respondents said because it's either contains sensitive data or they didn't obtain permission of the participants. I mean, the second part would be very easy to fix because you usually need them to sign a consent form anyway. So you would just need to explain, well, we will share an anonymized version of the data along with the paper once it's accepted. And about the sensitive data, also something I already mentioned before, you would maybe just have to either be a bit more sensitive upfront about which data you actually collect, or look into how to properly anonymize it. Then both of these might not be such a big issue. But again, this is perception. So people perceive there to be a problem. And so maybe there's a gap again between what can actually be done without too much extra work and what people think they should do. So this is kind of an opportunity for actually educating researchers a bit more about how to handle this sort of data, maybe. So an important example, and again, kind of probably preaching to the choir here, is that sharing has actually very tangible benefits for the researchers. So, for example, a very common example in our community is the €1 filter or the $1 filter. Sometimes it's also called, I think that was the predecessor, which is an open source gesture recognizing filter, or mouse input, even VR controller input. You can filter a lot of things with it. And here you can see how many people have kind of made their own versions of that. And of course, that's then results in more citations for this paper. So there can be quite tangible benefits to actually sharing your source code, your research artifacts in the widest sense, in a way that other people can use them. There's of course a bit of planning upfront involved. So to make a plan upfront about your research, which we all know might not be that easy, because you're in many situations you just have to sort of decide on the spot what to do next. But still, it would be better in the long term if we could have a bit of a more upfront plan, including about how to store the data, collect not too much data, then to kind of consider the trade-offs here between how much to share in terms of transparency. Of course, you want to share as much as possible, but yes, you still need to consider your participants' privacy. You need to consider your own effort. That's not, it would be unrealistic not to. And also, how much pre-processing would you actually allow for your data before it's shared? Then about the where to share, we have this FAIR principle. It should be findable, accessible, immutable, and reusable. And for GitHub, for example, the I doesn't hold. So it's not immutable, because you could just update it or delete it or whatever. The rest will probably work for GitHub, but the I is out. And one very important aspect that I think we all should kind of hold people to kind of account to, for example, if you do a review or so, if people don't share their data, then there may be very good reasons for that, but at least say so. And that can be just 1 or 2 sentences in the discussion, but still, please do consider, why don't you share your data? And maybe just thinking about that can push people a little towards the direction of actually sharing their data. After all, once they realize they actually don't have that good of a reason not to do it. So what I am telling my students, and again, this is not the perfect solution, but it's the path of least resistance in a way. What I'm telling my students is, even if you just dump a snapshot of your project directory on GitHub, it's still better than not doing so. Because even if people can't run it right out of the box, they can still kind of look up what's going on under the hood, and that's the most important aspect. So I think we should all consider, and we and those where we kind of want to push forward the whole idea of replication, consider that sharing these artifacts is also a part of doing research right, in a sense, because otherwise, looping back to our initial argument, there's nothing for others to build on top of. And so this is really an aspect of the whole process that we shouldn't neglect. For HCI specifically, there might actually be an opportunity to build better tools that enable people to work on to share their data more easily, prepare their data more easily, and so on. So that's maybe not quite as relevant for this conference here, but for HCI as a whole, there might be an opportunity here to actually build better tools that enable people to have better scientific practices without much effort, hopefully. Yeah, and with that, I think I'm at the end of my talk. So what I mentioned before is GitHub isn't perfect, but what you can very easily do is, after you put it on GitHub, just make a snapshot and put that on OSF. Then you have the convenience of GitHub and the archiving features of OSF at the same time. then the others I already talked about. Collect only the data that you actually need. Put your data on some sort of open repository of whatever type. And so that's like the most common misconceptions that we hope might get a little better in the future. But as we saw in our data, there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I think that's it for now. So thank you for listening, and I hope there are questions.
Thank you so much, Florian. Yeah, we're open for questions now. No one seems to have one. Ed.
So I want to kind of re-stress the importance of archival places. So Florian, you made excellent points about putting something on a place like OSF. There's no promise that anything on GitHub will be there in 10 years or any number of years, you know.
Yeah.
And I will say a nice thing about GitHub versus, say, shared Google directories or something, you know, you can, with GitHub, every change to whatever you upload is tracked and preserved. So
yeah,
with,
that's also a good point.
You know, with Google Files and so forth, somebody can delete something even accidentally, and that deletion just kind of goes machine to machine, you know, like a virus, and it's gone for everyone.
Yeah,
that's a great advantage of GitHub or that kind of model.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people are kind of let's say the more hacker-minded people have also figured out that you can kind of edit the GitHub history in a way and make it do weird stuff, but that requires intent. The much more important aspect is that you're safe from accidents like, oh, I deleted the Google Drive folder and now it's gone. So absolutely agree with that.
It's also worth pointing out that journals are increasingly making it possible to upload additional files, in some cases in arbitrary formats along with a paper. And that's a great archival location because the digital libraries are already, the goal is to preserve those in perpetuity. So.
Yes, that's true.
So great talk.
Thank you.
Any other questions come up? Okay. Okay, then thank you, Florian, so much for your talk.
Thank you again for having me. And wait, I'll stop the screen share, I guess.
Okay, yeah, then I think we continue with our short coffee break. And after that, we have 2 more talks. Maybe we can meet again in about 20 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Can you actually show my screen? Because it's not showing somehow. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so now I'm actually going to present our paper, which is about content transfer across multiple screens with combined eye gaze and touch interaction, a replication study. And so basically we wanted to go through the process of replicating a study ourselves. So to just validate the findings and reflect on the whole process of a replication. And so we chose one of our previous studies, which was about content transfer across multiple screens, which means, as you can see in the sketch, there are multiple screens, and you somehow want to interact with them. And in our case, this was a touch screen or touchpad. And what's basically the problem is if you have many screens, then it could be really tedious to swipe through all these screens. So we tried to come up with 2 different techniques to do this more efficiently. And the first one was a bimanual technique, where we used both hands. So basically, we used our right or dominant hand for just using the touchpad as you would on a laptop, for example. So you move around and the cursor also moves. And if you want to change screens, you use your non-dominant hand to tap the border of the screen, and then you can swipe through these many screens. Yeah, here's also a short video where you can see this. So you can also actually see the task here already, which was to grab some point and move it to some other screen and place it there. And as you see, it's not that fast. It always takes a while until this yellow border, which indicates the active screen, moves to the correct position. And then we also had a technique that combined eye gaze with the touch. And in this case, basically the active screen was always the one the user is looking at. So you just look at another screen and it will automatically become active, and you can move within that screen using your touch hand. And that's also what you can see in this video, where you see that this yellow border directly follows the gaze of the user, wherever he's looking. Yes, so to our task, as I already mentioned, it was to move the object to some target on another screen. And our study design was a 2x2 within subjects design. So we directly replicated this in this study. The independent variables were the interaction technique that I already presented, which was either the bimanual technique or the gaze and touch technique. And we also had 2 different numbers of screens. Once it was just 4 screens, and once it was 15 screens. And in both the original and the replication study, we also measured some dependent variables, which were the task completion time, accuracy, task load, simulator thickness, and the usability of the system. So here you can see our setup, which consisted of an HTC Vive Pro Eye, which could detect the eye gaze, and this Huawei MediaPad tablet, and an OptiTrack Trio, which was used to detect the position of the tablet and also the position of the fingertips, which we marked with some OptiTrack markers. And in addition, there was also some Velcro on the border of the tablet so that participants could easily identify the border area without needing to look down. And in the procedure, the participants first filled out demographic questionnaires, and we calibrated the eye tracking for each individual participant. The 4 conditions were balanced using a Latin square. And for each condition, then they had a short training phase where they could adjust to this technique. Then they did the actual task and answered some questionnaires. And after all 4 tasks, we also asked them about their preferences and conducted a short interview. Yeah. So now I'm coming to the results, and I will directly compare our new results to the results of the original study. So first about the participants. In both cases, we had 14 participants, 5 of which were female. The mean age was slightly higher in the original study, which was around 30, and this time around 27. And the most apparent difference is in the VR experience, I would say, because in the previous study, all the participants had prior VR experience, and there were 6 people that were reported that they had used it often or even very frequently. And in the new study, there were 2 participants who had no VR experience at all, and only one person who reported that they use it often. So generally, they were much less experienced in this replication study. So for the results, for the task completion time, you can see from the original and replication studies, the times are pretty similar. So in the, for example, the gaze space mean was 3.7 seconds in the original study and 3.78 seconds in the new study. And also the other values are really similar. And also the statistical analysis gave the same result, that the gaze-based technique was significantly faster than the bimanual technique. You can see the results of the accuracy, which were also pretty similar, I would say, and also resulted in the same result, that there was no significant differences between these two techniques regarding accuracy. So we just measured how far was the point that they put somewhere from the actual target. And now we're coming to simulated sickness, where there was actually a difference between the two studies. So in the original study, we could find that the bimanual technique led to a significantly higher simulated sickness, but we could not confirm this in our replication study. And I think it's also really interesting that if you look at the overall mean of this simulated sickness scores, they were much higher in the replication study, around 55%. And we guess that this could explain due to this inexperienced users, because if you're using VR for the first time, it might cause more severe simulated sickness. Yeah. Here are the results from the task load, which were again basically the same. So in both cases, there was less task load in the gaze-based technique. Yet also here you can see that the replication study had a slightly higher task load than the original study, which could also again be speculated that this is because of the more inexperienced users. And regarding the usability, we got the same result as well, so that gaze-based technique was more usable, significantly more usable than the bimanual technique. Yeah, in this case, there are also not that much differences in the values exactly. So that brings me already to my conclusion. So we could find that in our case, we could replicate most of the findings, except for this simulated sickness findings. Yet we see that especially the subjective feedback can be quite different. So it seems like the objective feedback from the accuracy and the task completion time holds true for different groups of participants. But for the small subjective measures with the questionnaires, it differs quite a bit. Yeah, so especially for this study, for the original study, we did it, I think, around the time when COVID started. So we were really limited in the pool of available participants. So I think this also take away from this that maybe we should have a little bit more effort to also get more diverse participants. As in the first study, for example, most of them were from our lab or from our university. So they had more experience with VR. And this time we were able to get more participants also from outside. Yes. And also what I noticed when I did this, so I also conducted the previous study. So basically I should know how everything works, and it should be really easy to replicate it, but I noticed that there are still always a lot of things you need to figure out again. And so my take back from this is also that documentation is really important, and also even if you think everything is easy and trivial, it's better to really write it down. And that's especially true if you want to make it publicly available, as already some of the other presenters said, that you really make it easy also for other people to use. Yes, and that's already my end. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can ask now. Not the case? Okay. I will just have a look at Zoom if there's anything. No. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to present one of our replication studies, vocabulary replicator, which is a study that we conducted based on a recent project that we did for vocabulary learning using augmented reality environments. So first, before delving into our study, I would like to bring your attention on this conceptual space proposed by Geran and authors for gesture extraction studies that shows how different dimensions can be used to describe the reproducibility of user studies. Even though the studies have been categorized here are not any MR related studies, we could easily adapt the dimension of this space and conduct a background study to see how MR replications studies may fall within this space. For example, all the studies or the talks that we heard today, we can use these studies and categorize them based on this conceptual space. So as a start for that, later in this presentation, I will show you where our study is standing within this design space. So briefly, before talk about the replication study, I would like to mention what is the original study that we conducted. So our study is vocabulary, which is based on these three concepts: keyword method, then context-based learning, and augmented reality. So if you don't have any idea what is keyword method, don't worry, I will explain this in my next slide and show you what are the study conditions that we conducted and who are the participants and the analysis and conclusions of both studies. So as this vocabulary project is about learning new words of a foreign language, so we adapted this learning approach called keyword method, which is a mnemonic technique that would help you to remember words easily. So for example, let's say that apple, I want to learn this word apple in Japanese, which is ringo. So the keyword methods means you can come up with a word which is phonetically sounds like the same, a word that you already know. For example, in this case, ringo, it sounds like ring plus go, right? So I can come up with an association or a mental image which represent this ring plus go. As you can see here, so I can come up with this mental image that there's a ring going for a walk, holding hands with an apple. So we combine this keyword with the real context and create a new link in order to remember the foreign word that we need to learn. So this is basically the keyword method. So we adapted this keyword method in order to create an application for vocabulary learning. So in our study, we created two different prototype systems. One is for augmented reality head-mounted displays, and the other one is for non-AR or one of Android devices. At the end, we wanted to compare these two conditions with additional two conditions that include keyword method with visualization and without visualization. And at the end, we want to see what are the differences in terms of participants' performances, like immediate recall and delayed recall, and also their mental effort, task completion time, and also the learning efficiency at the end. So as you can see here, in the first condition, AR condition keyword, you can see the context, which is a postcard, and we show you the textual and also audio information of this word. In here, postcard is hagaki, so you can see the keyword hagaki. And then in the second condition, apart from the textual and audio information, you could also see the visualization of this specific keyword, hagaki, and you can see there's a key hugging by two hands. And then we replicated the same thing in non-AR condition, which is an Android device. It doesn't have the context, so we just have a image of the environment, the same environment with the same set of objects, and use the same two different keyword and keyword plus visualization method. So through this, I think that you can have a basic idea about the conditions that we had in our vocabulary learning prototypes. I'm not going to go into more details as we are also going to present this in the journal track on Wednesday. So if you are interested about the original study and the results, you could also join that talk. And then in order to conduct this user study for both original and the replication studies, we use this mixed design, which contains both between subjects and within subject design. So there we use the interface or AR and non-AR as our between subject factors, and also the instruction mode or the keyword and keyword plus visualization as within subject factors. And then we conducted our original study with the age group of 19 to 30 years old, which are basically university students. And then we did our replication study with another age group from 14 to 19, which are basically middle school and high school students. And then we compared the results for both of these studies and try to understand how the final results would differ from each other. And as I mentioned before, I explained the study and also the extra explication study. And then if I try to fit our study into the conceptual space that I showed before, we can tell that we can put into generalizability as we had a new set of participants, but we used the same method in order to conduct the study and the evaluation process. And then at the end, as I mentioned before, we compared our result with respect to performances, which are immediate recall, and then mental effort, task completion time, and immediate efficiency. Because we didn't have enough time to conduct the delayed recall test for the replication study, so we had to omitted these results, and we just compare these four variables at the end. So here you can see in the original study and the replication study, the patterns of immediate recall and mental effort and immediate efficiency are more or less the same. But interestingly, we could find the difference between the task completion time of between the original study and the replication study. And also we analyze the difference between two studies, the original study and the replication study, but we conducted this analysis only for the AR condition as we had some practical limitations for the non-AR condition. So there we could see that there wasn't any significant difference between these two age groups for immediate recall and immediate efficiency, but there was a significant difference between age group for mental effort and task completion time. As you can see in the second one, the mental effort of the young users are lower compared to the adult users, and the task completion time is also less or lower to the compared to the adult users of this AR condition, which is quite interesting. So we assume that yes, young users, they can put less effort and complete a task in a short period time and can achieve the same performances. So if I wrap up this whole replication study, at the end, what we got is like for the immediate recall and immediate efficiency, for both original study and replication study were the same. But for mental effort and task completion time, we had a different results for the replication study, which we use a different age group from 14 to 19 years old younger users. So at the end, I would like to thank all of my co-authors from both University of Primorska and University of Coburg. Okay, if you want to know about more about this paper, you can go through our paper, Vocabulary Replicated, Comparing Teenagers to Young Adults. If you want to know more about the original study, you could also read the journal track paper, Vocabulary, Learning Vocabulary and AR Supported Keywords. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, I would like to have them now.
Thank you so much, Marsha. Yeah, are there any questions from the audience? Okay. Yeah, then I would say we're through with this part. We have one part remaining in the schedule about discussion and wrap up. So we just wanted to give you the chance again to say something. Did you get any new ideas that you want to share? Yeah, are there any points you'd like to discuss? Okay, yeah. So it's already pretty late, so I guess we can wrap it up here. Thank you all so much for attending. Yeah, and see you around at the conference.